Hello, this is Daniel, and I'm going to be presenting a description of implementation of a web service in the cloud using the PHP scripting language, Apache, web services, and Zend Studio for development. The version PHP used 5.3, and also using native SOAP extensions of PHP. The Apache web services will be used in the Linux server, remote server itself, and on my local environment. For this purposes, it was XAMPP, the cross-platform Apache MySQL, and PHP. And Zend Studio version 8 was the primary development environment for code creation and debugging. Notepad++ was also used initially. The WSDL first approach was one of the requirements, a top-down method where the WSDL's analyzed and codes created to match the WSDL's requirements. It generated a skeletal implementation code from a tool I discovered called WSDL to PHP. Pretty basic and doesn't hit all the areas, but was a starting place. And then I created the service code itself, which consisted of methods and additional classes and functions based on the WSDL definitions. The Add3 service itself consisted of a single operation. You'll see on the left and the right in this picture the message, or the SOAP messages, and below them in the gray are the two graphical representations, being the form in the web browser, which consists of a couple fields and a button to create the sum of the integers and pass the hard-coded name. Again, this reiterates the same thing. SOAP messaging was created according to the WSDL operations, and this entire package was tested locally and was pushed up to the remote server for the additional testing purposes. The overall goal being to describe services to any external clients connecting to the web service. Here's a snapshot of the Add3 service WSDL I was working with. This types area, you'll see the 5 required variables, and you'll also see right here the add3ints and the add3ints response. These were the relevant data types that would explain how the messages were passed, or not how they were passed, but the format in which the messages would be taking. Beneath that, you'll see under the messages itself, these were relatively abstract definitions of the data itself. And the names you'll see are also the same, add3ints and the responses here. They basically had an association with the data types above. And there's more to the definitions. Let me browse down a little bit. You'll see our URL. This is the URL that actually is where the service is. In this particular case, this is the remote server on the Linux EC2 instance. It specifies the binding address for the service, and the service name is really just an aggregate for the set of related ports identified in all the previous definitions. So I'm going to the next slide. This is actually service code. These are the 5 variables that defined in the WSDL. Additional class was created to encapsulate the function, the add3 function, excuse me, add3ints function, which had a parameter of the message. This add3 message represented the the input and output SOAP messaging. So you'll see here there was an input in array message, and then the output here, both being arrays, one taking in the 5 values and the other returning the 5 values, which we saw in this representation on either side, the red being the messaging. So let me scroll back down. Before any development occurred, prerequisites had to be met. First, had to set up an EC2 account with Amazon Web Services. Also had to add funds to pay for the storage. In addition, software had to be installed and configured on the local machine, which was a Windows 7 professional workstation. And as you'll see here, I added a couple notes. PuTTY, FileZilla, Zend Studio, and XAMPP were the minimum pieces of software needed to begin development. Here's a snapshot of the Linux instance I created. This is the URL as well. If you can see where I'm pointing here, this is the actual URL of the Linux instance that was created. This is a snapshot of the PuTTY connection to the Linux instance. As you see here, I was starting the Apache Web Services to confirming they were running. And this was my local development environment. XAMPP was a pretty powerful tool. I actually used the portable application, so I could take it to and from wherever I was working and not having to configure the environment independently. The htdocs was a storage folder where all web service files were stored. So it was good. It was a good location, which again it was portable. It served me best. This is a snapshot of my web server, in XAMPP. That would, as you can see, it's a local host. So by this URL. This is the tool I was mentioning earlier. This was used after the fact when the majority of the code was created. It actually reads the WSDL, and it provides the skeleton. Or excuse me. This reads the URL of the final service, and but it allows me to test the service without creating a client. So basically, on the left, you'll see this is the SOAP input message, where it's asking for the values, and I plugged in a couple here. Didn't need to do the last two, but what happens is when I hit the green button here, it executes. Oops. It executes the call to the service by passing the SOAP message, and this is the output of it. You'll see this is hard-coded information in the actual service code. So I didn't enter it here, but you'll see it over here. Very useful tool in the testing. Notepad, another tool I use in basic editing in the PHP code. Not as powerful as Zend Studio, which you'll see here. This is a snapshot of the function, the add3inst function, and it has superior coding abilities beyond that of the Notepad++, which were very useful in the debugging as well. PuTTY, the other tool that I would mention, allowed me to connect to the Linux instance. Here's the URL for connectivity, and also you public key encryption. Here on the right side you'll see the window where I would just add the key in and connect to it. Here's another snapshot of the actual connection to the shell on the Linux box. And here I believe I was changing the group designation by assigning different properties or permissions to the EC2 user group. This is another shot of the local environment. The tool was FileZilla was used to transfer files from my local machine, which you'll see on the left here. This is a snapshot of my local machine, and on the right you'll see the Linux server. This in particular was the var//www subfolder, and then ultimately the files went into the HTML subfolder where all the web service files resided. Another tool were web browsers. I used a variety of them to get a better feel of what the service looked like. and if it worked properly in the different browsers. Also was taken into consideration was the compatibility with the new development environment. Zend Studio and NetBeans both integrated well, so I could do my browser testing directly from it, opposed to just running it independent. And this is the tool that I was referring to that aided in the skeleton code. I would take the URL, and I did it locally as well, but this is I believe this is Dr. Wild's. I plugged it in and just gave it a pseudo class name, hit generate code, and it spit out this, created the majority of it. It's not all exactly how I used it, but it does provide a great framework. It created the variables, the pseudo class name, and it also created a class. I think it used class mapping in this particular example, which I did not use. And then it showed an example of the function. This is the SOAP client connection. It used a different method, slightly different method than I did, but good representation of the overall skeleton code. The remote environment, it consisted of the Apache web service, which I mentioned, PHP processing engine, which is part of the Apache, the Linux instance that was provided. And this was the tester provided by Dr. Wild that I used exclusively. You'll see in this example, this is another of Dr. Wild's examples, or his services provided. I plugged in a few values for testing. Provide the correct URL and hit submit. You'll see that the integers are reflected here. That returned an output as well, which is correct, and then the hard-coded name that was used in the service code. So we can see it returned the correct information. In the development environment, I did encounter a few issues. The first, as I mentioned, was a browser discrepancies, and what I mean by that is I noticed when I ran the same service code testing to different browsers. In particular, I'll go forward. This is a screenshot from Google Chrome. Looks pretty generic, and it occurred quite often. I finally came to the conclusion that each browser has a different default setting for caching information. This one was problematic, and it took me a while to figure out what it was, but didn't have the same behavior from the other browsers. This was not a particular error or issue I encountered directly, more from the other side of the equation as the other SOAP clients were connecting. Now those users that were using C# or Java encountered some issues connecting to the PHP service that I created. And like I mentioned, that didn't occur from my end, but it was something that had to be troubleshot from different directions. And another issue was that of using the new SOAP extensions. My initial test did not allow me to create the WSDL the way it should have been represented. It seemed as though incorporating new SOAP into the service code prompted different errors. And some were not easily overcome, so I resorted to switching to the native SOAP PHP libraries on both the local environment and the Linux box, and that had a slight obstacle as well. I had to alter the PHP INI file on both to get that to work. The WSDL first, in and of itself, is more difficult than bottom up because it requires interpretation of the WSDL. And like I mentioned, different development environments, all useful in their own right. Just found Zend Studio to be a little more compatible with the web browsers. As the error we saw, and my impression of of the technology package, I used PHP simpler to use in other programming languages I've had experience with. and judging from the issues related to the other platforms that connected to this PHP web service, it seemed like this one was less problematic when compared to Glassfish or IIS. I did encounter a few difficulties trying to find documentation for PHP based web services. A little harder to find. And one of the things I noted, as I mentioned before, WSDL approach is more challenging than its counterpart, bottom up. As I read from more and more research, it seemed that doing or developing from the top down, let the user be keep his code less dependent on other technologies. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed.